Welcome back to the Brahmin Word, and we are continuing and ending our look at Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. So, if you would turn with me to Genesis chapter 19, or turn back there. Um, the first parts of this on Tuesday, a couple days ago, was extremely just heavy. And I think it's because of the situation that was in Sodom and Gomorrah, and just how God responds to our sin. And today we're going to go. It's still going to be a warning, but it's going to be about how us as believers, how do we as followers of Jesus, react to a culture that is spiraling around us. And I think Lot shows how not to react. But I think that is interesting to say the least. And so go back to Genesis chapter 19. We're going to start from verses 15 through 22. Verses 15 through 22. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, Up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. Uh, but he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his two daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. The men that seized him in verse 16, that's not the men of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's talking about the two angels. That's who we're talking about there in verse 16. So what's interesting here is a couple things. First off, you see that Lot is given this task in verses 12 through 13, where he is supposed to tell anybody that he loves and cares about, you need to get out of the city because it is about to be destroyed. But when he does so, and he talks to his sons-in-law in verse 14, they make fun of him, or they basically think that he's making fun of them. They don't take him seriously, which makes me wonder what kind of character Lot had in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, to the point where his own sons-in-law thought that he was making this stuff up, even though the talk of the town was the fact that there are these two strangers there that made a bunch of people blind in verse 11. And so you would think that they would take him seriously, but they don't. And they thought that he was jesting, according to the end of verse 14. And so you already start to see what is going on with Lot here, especially when it comes to his response to the community of Sodom and Gomorrah that he lives in. And then, but of course, we see that the grace of the Lord, by making sure that his wife and his two daughters get out of the city. But I think verse 16, but he lingered. You almost think maybe Lot's thinking that maybe this won't happen, that the destruction won't happen, or that his sons-in-law will finally come to their senses and get out of the city along with his wife and Lot's wife and their two daughters. So he lingers, but thankfully the angels get them out of the city, and that is seen as the Lord being merciful to Lot, according to verse 16. And then they give them command in verse 17. And as they brought them out, one of the angels said, Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And so there is this just straightforward command. And yet, just a few verses later, in verse 26, but Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, don't get me wrong, she made that decision, right? She made the decision to look back, but yet Lot should have taken the role of a loving husband, not a dictator, like, hey, you have to do what I say. But look, honey, I love you and I want our family to escape this destruction. And here is what these men who are angels, what these men said to us, that if we do this, this is what is going to happen. If we look back, we will be turned into pillars of salt. And well, that's what happened. And but it almost seems like Lot did not step up in that way to do that with his wife. So Lot is just really just kind of failing, which he continues to do, right? But Lot has something to say to them um, on their command to not look back and to escape to the hills. Verse 18, and Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life," which is true. The Lord has done that. But I think it isn't necessarily because of Lot, but it's because of Abraham. I think that is something we have to keep in mind here. So back to verse 19. But I cannot escape to the hills lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, the city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved. It's an interesting request because the angels say that if you go to the hills, um, if you don't go to the hills, you will be swept away in the destruction. But if you go to the hills, you will be safe. And yet, Lot does not believe them clearly because he says, I cannot escape to the hills lest the disaster overtake me and I die. He believes that if he goes to the hills, he won't be safe, even though the angels have told him that he would. And so he is dealing with a lot of um, emotional issues here. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to blame Lot here, because if I was in this situation, it would be very, very tense. It'd be very sad situation too. I probably wouldn't be thinking straight. And so I'm not trying to blame Lot here. I'm just trying to show, okay, these are the things that we should not do in the midst of a culture that is spiraling. And we'll get to that in a second. Um, so the angel says to him based on this request, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing until you arrive there." Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar, which that city name means little. Pretty straightforward, right? So, but it's interesting because it is just Sodom and Gomorrah that are destroyed, and it's not this little city called Zoar. Mainly, yes, because Lot is escaping there. So it makes you wonder, would Zoar have been impacted if Lot did not go there? It just it makes it makes you wonder if that's the case. And so that's why we see in verse 23 that he came to Zoar, because we talked a little bit, we looked at that verse last time, so we're saying that up. But you have this person that is in this midst of this culture. His words aren't really taken seriously by his neighbors, especially his sons-in-law, that are from Sodom and Gomorrah. But then you have the fact that you're not sticking up for, you're not making sure that you are looking out for your family, and then you're also doubting the words of the Lord as well. And that is not how we should respond when our culture is spiraling. We should be this example to our neighbors about how to react to times of struggle. Now, that doesn't mean that that we have to be perfect, but even in the midst where we mess up, that we should show, okay, yes, I messed up, and this is how I'm going to respond in kind with confession and repentance. That's how we should respond. For those that are married, you should help your spouse and make sure that you look after them. If the Lord if there is a warning out there, then be aware of it. Let your spouse be aware of it. That is something that we have to do. And then finally, um, trust in the words of the Lord. Trust in the words of the Lord. And we'll see what that means in a second when it comes to how we need to protect our children, because we're going to dive into that sad part of the story now. Go down to verse 30 of chapter 19. Genesis chapter 19, verse 30. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. This is incredibly ironic, isn't it? Because Lot was scared to go into the hills where the Lord asked him to go because he thought he wouldn't be safe. And so instead he goes to Zoar, which the Lord makes safe for him, and he still isn't confident that he's going to be safe there. So he goes to the original place where the Lord told him that he would be safe. I find that incredibly ironic, but also incredibly sad, isn't it? So he goes there. His wife has been turned into a pillar of salt. She has died, and so he is with his 2 his 2 daughters, which have lost their husbands, the sons-in-law, in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah at this point. And so the story just gets worse, basically. Verse 31. And the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. So don't get me wrong, grief is a very impactful thing, and obviously these daughters are experiencing grief from losing their husbands or lost sons-in-law, and so for them to make this statement that there is not a man on earth to have sexual relations with us, that seems just so desperate of a statement. But if you're in their shoes, then you've just lost your husband, you've lost your mother, you've lost your community, you've lost your friends, and your father is just kind of just he's just emotionally off the wagon, and now you're living in the hills. You're not even living in this tiny city called Zoar, but you're living in the hills. It makes sense why they're a little bit despairing. Now, what comes after this in verse 32 is awful. I'm not going to condone it, but for them to be in this manner of desperation and for them to be in this manner of grief, it makes sense. But then they take it too far. Verse 32. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, have sexual relations with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that evening, and the firstborn went in and had sex with her father, or lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. So you have just this. Oh, so not only has Lot just gone through all the things that we talked about when it comes to verses 15 through 22, but now it's just this failing of fatherhood. Not only that, but then he gets to the point where he's drunk to the point where he can't even observe that it's his own daughter. I mean, it's just everything seems to be falling apart. But we shouldn't be surprised from the man that offered his daughters for sex to these people in Sodom and Gomorrah. When it comes to that, you go to verse 7, up in verse 7, and Lot said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Verse 8, Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. I mean, it is just the failing of fatherhood here. And not only that, but No wonder his daughters are thinking this way, because he clearly does not have a godly view of sex, but he also does not have a godly view of family either. I mean, it is just this debased mind. And the thing that I take away from this is because I think he became Lot. I think he became too attached to Sodom and Gomorrah. And not just in like a physical, this is my home, but a spiritual, a mental, and an emotional standpoint. And he just gets lost in the culture. And this kind of goes back to Jesus' prayer, doesn't it? When he prays that the disciples, that they're not taken out of the world, but they're not of the world. So the Lord does not want us to just sit at our house and never leave, so that we never have to deal with the culture and we never have to deal with anything bad from that. I don't think that's what he meant. I think what he means is, Lord, um, keep them on the path of sanctification. Like he wants us to continue to strive and be more like him, but he doesn't want us to leave our culture, because he wants us to show our culture what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Amen. And so I think Lot had a great opportunity to do this, and yet he just failed. And again, I'm not trying to blame Lot and say that he's like the worst person ever in history, right? But there are so many things that we can learn from Lot. But let's continue on, because this is just one daughter. Sadly, the younger has the same mindset. Verse 34, the next day the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. Ugh. I mean, that verse just makes you cringe, doesn't it? Incest does that, right? But oh my gosh, it's just this ugh, moment where you are just like, what is going on? Um, and so not only does this work one time, but it works the next time. And not only that, but they do this in a span of 24 hours, one night to the next night. It's not like there was time in between where they could get Lot maybe to really forget about. No, it just happens right away. And Lot still has no clue what's going on. Now, granted, could you say that this is a form of rape? Maybe. But it's just the fact that a father is not doing what he is supposed to do. And that is incredibly harmful, not just for these young girls' lives, but for our culture at large. To not have godly fathers is such, no wonder we are dealing with the culture that we are in this country, because we don't have fathers that are striving to be more and more like Jesus and help their families to do the same. No wonder we are experiencing this. Um, Now, there are children that are born to the daughters of Lot, verses 37-38. Let's wrap this part up. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab, um, which means from father. Again, just, but he is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben Ami, which means son of my people, which again is this kind of incest background to it, and he is the father of the Ammonites to this day. The Moabites and the Ammonites shouldn't come as a shocker here, but they turn out to be one of the bigger. Uh, they turn out to be one of the bigger, uh, just enemies of the country of the people of Israel later on, and it's just this sad. It's just this really, really sad point in biblical history, but in history in general. The fact that a father would allow this to happen is just incredibly sad. So, what can we learn from Lot when it comes to the culture? We already talked a little bit about making sure that you are an example to your community around you, that you are a witness for the gospel. We also talked about making sure that you are a godly. That you are a godly husband, or if you're watching and you are a lady, that you are a godly wife to your husband, showing the importance and the value of marriage and what marriage actually is between a man and a woman, which again is seen at the end of Genesis chapter 2 and in verse 24, I believe. But then finally, you had earlier where they should listen to, where we should listen to the words of the Lord, no matter the circumstance, no matter where our culture is going as well. And then finally, you have this section where believers, especially believing parents, we desperately need godly fathers and godly mothers within our society to help our children navigate what is good and what is wrong, and eventually to get them to the point where they themselves on their own can get to the point where they believe and trust in Jesus. Amen. And I just think that that is so important. I mean, no wonder we are struggling with the identity, um, gender identity in this country, is because we don't have fathers, we don't have mothers that are willing to step up and say a man is a man and a woman is a woman. And I think that is a really, really big part to play here. So the warnings from Sodom and Gomorrah are not just about sin and are not just about um, the response of the Lord to sin, which is the wrath of God. But I think it is a warning to us as believers uh, on how we need to act within our culture that is spiraling. Because at the end of the day, we know that this world is doomed because it is tainted by and marred by the sinful nature and by death. Now, eventually, thankfully, Jesus will come and will set everything correct, and we will live in a new earth and a new heaven that is without sin and without death. And so I'm so thankful for that grace that the Lord gives to his children, those that believe and trust in Him as Lord. I'm so grateful for that from Jesus. But in the meantime, that doesn't mean that we give up on our culture either. That means that we try to show them, look, this is what marriage is, and this is why marriage is important. Look, this is what being a godly father and a godly mother is, and this is why it is important. This is why we should go out to our culture and show, look, this is what a believer is. Now, that doesn't mean that just because you do that, everything's going to be just roses. Everybody's gonna be like, oh, you make such a good point, I'll do that. No, of course not. And that's not what Sodom and Gomorrah did. But eventually the Lord showed justice when it came to the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, and at at some point in the future, when the Lord returns, he will show justice to every single person that rejected Jesus. They will spend eternity in a place called hell. And that is coming. But in the meantime, you and I, as believers, are given such a great opportunity to spend time in the culture and to make sure that we show our culture what it means to follow after Jesus. And so, hopefully, this two-part videos, which are definitely longer, and I do apologize about that. Once we get back to next week, when we get back to the life of Abraham, they will be shorter, I promise. But I feel like with Sodom and Gomorrah, we need to take time to really unpack this moment in this very dark moment in history, and one, what we can learn from that about sin and about God's wrath, but then two, how we as believers and followers of Jesus should respond to our culture, not give in to it, but at the same time, not begging to be taken out of it. Instead, make sure that we stand on our biblical principles. We strive to continue to be more and more like Jesus, showing the way to do that as an example for those that are unbelievers that are around us. And then finally, to set up godly principles for the culture and our neighbors around us. And so hopefully this two-parter, even though it is dark and even though it is heavy to talk about, I hope that you have learned something from it, and that you, as a believer and follower of Jesus, will take that and hopefully impact your culture, your local community that you are in, for the cause of Christ. Thanks, and I will see you next week as we continue on with the life of Abraham. Thanks.